A new report into political party funding has recommended greater transparency and restrictions on how much can be donated. The research was carried out by Institute for Governance and Policy Studies Senior Associate Max Rashbrook and Victoria University Professor of Taxation Lisa Marriott. They join me now. So how worried should we be about the current rules around political donations?
Well, I think we should be concerned. For our research, we spoke to a lot of donors and fundraisers and people who work in the system, and one of them described it to us as an accident waiting to happen, because there's a lot of room to get around the rules about disclosing who's donating to political parties, and the Electoral Commission doesn't have very strong powers at all to check up on donation fraud. So there's an awful lot of room for donors to exercise influence and access.
Are we waiting for it to happen, or has the accident already happened?
Well, there's been a fair few accidents that have happened. So one of the things we did do was a timeline of scandals across the last 15 or 20 years, and there are quite a few of them. There appear to be getting more, but concerningly, there has only been one successful prosecution so far.
Because the rules have always been set where it seems that the political parties are always able to somehow get round them a bit and say, oh, well, we followed the rules, even if from an outside observer's point of view you would have thought that was a little bit shonky.
Yeah, there's often a fair amount of probably legal advice that has gone into setting up some of the structures that we see that are, in some cases, deliberately built to work around the rules.
But we can also close, we can, and we have closed loopholes. So, for instance, Labor used to do a lot of that sort of trick of using art auctions and, claiming that the money they raised through them had been given by the person who did the painting rather than the person who bought it. But that seems to have been clamped down on. So, it is always possible to close loopholes. Yes, people will always try to get around them, but just like in any other area of the law, any other area, criminal law, you just have to keep trying to stop the ruses as they come up.
So your proposals are to make donations of $1,500 and more that they're declared, so we know who gives them, but also put a cap that the most anyone could donate is $15,000. What impact do you think that would have on transparency and sort of, if you like, diluting that influence that you've obviously in the report imply that big money can have?
Yes, I think that's right. I think that if you sort of look at those different recommendations, we think anyone giving over $1,500 should have to disclose their name, because it is obvious that people giving that much money are turning up at these sort of conferences with politicians and getting a bit of access to politicians, and it's low-level stuff, but there's enough there that we think we should know who those people are. And then at the higher end of the spectrum, the reason we've gone for a limit of $15,000 on the amount you can donate is it does feel like at the higher levels, the people who are giving $50,000 or $100,000, they're really getting an extraordinary level of access to politicians that the rest of us just simply couldn't get.
But are they able to buy policies? Are they able to, with that sort of money, ensure that the policy that they want in any particular area is actually put in place by whatever government they support?
Well, the transparency is not sufficient to make that connection. We can, and we have been told certainly from donors that they expect access from their donations, so that might be a meeting or a dinner or what have you. However, the lack of clarity is in that gap between getting the access and the influence, because you don't actually know what happens at those private dinners and the conversations that take place. However, it's reasonably safe to assume that there are conversations around preferences, and policy is, I would imagine, likely to be discussed at those sorts of events. We can't say categorically that there is some sort of cause and effect.
But we also know, for instance, from past events, not our research specifically, that politicians from both major political parties have intervened in police investigations in favour of donors. They've approved citizenship applications for donors against the advice of their own officials, and we also had people saying to us, well, if you donate $40,000, it makes it easier to get a meeting with a minister. And So I don't. We're not saying that New Zealand is a incredibly corrupt country where you can just buy laws just like that. What we are saying is that these donations are a part of a system of influence. So, you make the donation, you might also hire a lobbyist, you might also have some kind of personal connection with a politician. You add all those things up, and then suddenly some businesses or organisations or individuals have got a big head start on their rivals in a way that is completely unfair to everyone else. So these donations are part of a system of influence, I think is how I'd describe it.
I mean, Labor and the unions get criticised and attacked quite regularly for the money that unions give to the Labor Party leading up particularly to election campaigns, and then presumably see it in terms of changes to employment law, although it goes the other way, tell on the other side of politics. Is that an example of the sort of influence? But even then, aren't organisations like that clearly part of the political process is to try and lobby and influence and push forward a policy agenda? Where do you draw the balance between what you'd expect to happen in a democracy and what would cross a line to something more sinister?
Yeah, I guess the general view that unions donate huge sums of money to the Labour Party might be a wee bit overstated. I mean, they do make donations, but you see a lot more of individual donations, for example, going to perhaps National and ACT. So the unions now, whether you would even make the argument that they would have much influence with the amount of money that they donate, I'm not sure. We did speak to some union representatives. One of them said, perhaps they probably wouldn't be too unhappy if donations were capped and they couldn't donate.
Actually, sorry, I mean, I wasn't suggesting that. It was just that's the clearest example, because it seems to me they're the most transparent about the relationship, although they get criticised for it. It was just that,
I think there's, if you take Labour and National, they've both obviously got a sort of base in different parts of society and the economy, and for Labour it's unions and for National it's business. And there's absolutely nothing unhealthy about that at all. That's part of the fabric and the culture of those parties. But their relationship with the base in both cases should be one of sort of citizens being involved and people having influence through having the best arguments. So Labour are going to listen to trade union arguments, and that's fine, but they shouldn't be influenced by trade union money. And I would say the same with National. I mean, National will always be responsive to the views of business people, but that should be on an individual sort of basis. Each one of those individuals who's close to the National Party should have equal influence, or influence based on how strong their arguments are. They shouldn't have influence based on how much money they can give, and that goes across both parties.
But is it possible, though, that that on all sides the money's being given because someone agrees with the policy direction of a party, rather than it necessarily leverages them a specific kind of policy outcome?
Yes, and that's an argument. It's a really common argument. In fact, it's probably the most common argument. But alongside that, when you drill down into it, the donors that we spoke to did appear to, not always, but in some cases, expect a meeting or some sort of access. And there are some people who definitely did also tell us that they do donate because their values are aligned with the party that they donate to. So that's a bit of both.
And there's also the fundraising imbalance issue. So even if people aren't expecting something from their donation, they're still definitely donating to fund the views that they support. And you might say, well, that's fine. But if you have a situation as we do now, where since the last election, from the data that we have, National and ACT are out fundraising Labour and the Greens by about $5 million to $800,000, so they're 5 times more than the parties on the left. Then you have a really big imbalance in the ability of those two sides of politics to get their message out. The playing field isn't level at that point. So donations can be problematic even if they don't buy the donor a specific kind of influence.
Max Rashbrook, Lisa Marriott, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.